Oh, I'm going to make the question as difficult as I possibly can for you. Well, Emily, can you just kind of set the scene of what the original proposal was and why it represented such a major issue for ocean container shipping?
Yeah, and maybe just one step even further back, and that was where this report started.
Do you think that was the plan? Did they kind of present the absolute worst case scenario, knowing that, they might kind of concede some ground? I don't know.
I don't know. I think there's an element of if you want the industry to participate, you say something that will make them come to the table, right, and have those discussions.
Hello and welcome to The Freight Debate, the ultimate destination for supply chain professionals, logistics leaders, and anyone who's ever wondered what really keeps the world moving. I'm Phil Hennessy, and in this episode, we're going to look at the latest developments in ocean container shipping with my colleague, Emily Stausball. Hello, Emily.
Hi, Phil. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah. Well, probably worth setting the scene at the outset. We don't really have a script today, do we? So we've come back just after the Easter break, and we've had the update on the port fees, the US port fees on Chinese ships and carriers. So it's been another significant update for us to get our head around, but I'm sure, Emily, you can be the calm voice of reason in this maelstrom. So we'll cover the port fees, and we'll more generally talk about tariffs and escalation in the US-China trade war. But just on the kind of frequency first, Emily, is this just completely unique what we're seeing at the moment in terms of just how quickly things are changing? Because the previous disruptions that we've had, if you think about COVID, it was one, albeit extremely big issue, but it was one issue that kind of gradually increased in severity. If we look at the first US-China trade war during Trump's first presidency, that was kind of, one tariff after the other with a window of opportunity.
It was baby steps compared to this. It was nothing. So I think definitely compared to the first trade war, that comparison doesn't really hold water these days because we're just on such a different scale, right? Back then we were talking about specific goods getting 10, 20% tariffs when imported from China, right? Now the whole world gets 10% and we're up in, 145-ish on imports from China. So it's definitely closer to kind of the disruption we saw during the early months of the pandemic. To me, is a closer comparison than the first trade war at this point. But there are still some similarities, right? And I'm sure we'll get into those when it comes to front loading from certain countries and seeing what you can do to get around it.
It comes to something, doesn't it, when you're kind of reminiscing about gentler times of the first US-China trade war during Trump's first presidency. It seems like, a much gentler time looking back now, doesn't it, compared to the kind of chaos of it. Let's kick off with port fees. Significant update on Friday with the revised port fees. But Emily, can you just kind of set the scene of what the original proposal was and why it represented such a major issue for ocean container shipping?
Yeah, and maybe just one step even further back, and that was where this report started, right? It was actually a report started by the Biden administration at this time last year, looking into kind of Chinese shipbuilding and unfair practices there. And you can argue that that's a valid concern, right? It goes for China, it also goes for South Korea, right? These are nation states also interested in protecting their shipbuilding communities, and then they're kind of incentivizing the local carriers to order more ships there. But obviously now we're into the different administration is coming in on, and the original proposal was these really, really high costs. There were basically three ways you were getting hit. The first one was you were a Chinese carrier, and this is where we'll talk about Costco an awful lot this podcast. The second one was whether this ship you were calling it the US was built in China. And again, that's a substantial share of the fleet, but okay. And then the last one was this question of how much of your order book was in Chinese yards. And that's one that really hit. The six biggest carriers were all over 50%, which basically meant every time they called a US port, they were seeing a fee of $1 million, right? And let's just for the order book, add on another $1.5 million if it's a Chinese ship. And if you're Costco, add on another $1 million. for every single port call you make in the US. It was really, really huge numbers that you were looking at for these port calls.
So that's clearly why there was such a volume of adverse feedback during the public hearing, because we're not underplaying this, are we? In the significance of that first proposal, had it have come into effect, it would have been massive, wouldn't it?
It would have been massive. The costs for carriers would have been huge. They will, as they've always tried to do, try and pass those costs on. But there was also sort of operational ways around it, right? And that was where we've talked a lot about a risk for congestion. Because if you've got a service that's set up to call 3, maybe even 4 ports on the US East Coast, and it's costing you $3 million each time, you're going to stop calling all those ports, and that's where you get congestion build up. So it was really concerning, and the implementation time seemed quite short, which is why there's a lot of nervousness in the market. And I think, we sit here now after the revised proposal, kind of thinking, oh, well, that was lucky. But it applies a little bit the same way as we got after Liberation Day with those tariffs, right? Yes, it wasn't as bad as proposed, but if we had started on this proposal, we'd still be looking at it thinking this is a bad thing for how this industry works, right? And it's easy to get lost in that thinking, well, thanks to that didn't go too badly, but it's still not great.
Let me put my cynical hat on then. Do you think that was the plan? Did they kind of present the absolute worst case scenario, knowing that, they might kind of concede some ground? I don't know.
I don't know. I think there's an element of if you want the industry to participate, you say something that will make them come to the table, right? And have those discussions. So maybe pushing in that direction, that you really say, listen, let's make sure that everybody who has something to say on this comes forward now and can be kind of part of how we build the real solution. But at this rate, with all the forwards and backwards, I wouldn't commit to one of them.
No. So let's fast forward to Friday just gone, and we had the updated announcement from the US government. So what's in play now? What's the proposal?
So the proposal is very different now, and one major difference is that it counts only once per service rotation, right? So for container shipping, that means a service connecting Asia to the US, regardless of how many port calls, you get this one fee. And firstly, one of the really important things that's gone is the order book consideration is no longer there. So any of the non-Chinese operators, the only concern they have is whether they're sending Chinese-built ships to the US. The order book thing is out the window. And then the proposal for the fees is set up a little bit differently in this new proposal. You're looking at it on a net tonnage, so the size of the ship. In one consideration, you might also look at the capacity they have in TEU. But basically, you get a price per net ton if the operator of that ship is Chinese, and you get a price per net ton if that ship was built in China. And the fees are still pretty high, especially on those really big ships, right? It's still a substantial fee, but it does mean that there's more ways around it and more ways to looking up to sort of optimizing your fleet. And one other important difference is that ships under 4,000 TEU are no longer impacted, right? Because another thing about the previous proposal that was really still struggling to make full sense was that it was a flat fee regardless of the ship size. So if you were coming in on a ship with 1,000 containers, that fee had to be divided on 1,000 boxes rather than maybe 18,000 that were coming on those biggest ships. So that's also different, that the smallest ships on the smaller trades are exempted from this.
In very basic terms, summary, still bad, not quite as bad, and there's some avenues to reducing the impact of the new port fees.
Yeah, and it's not easy, and it will depend on the alliance, but there is a possibility there to avoid it in a way that there wasn't simply under the first proposal, other than to stop calling the US, which obviously is not a great solution.
No. So talking about the solutions, what are we looking at?
So let's start with the easy alliances. And when I say easy alliances, I'm thinking very quickly the Gemini Corporation, the Premier Alliance, and then the MSC kind of operating on its own. They have a certain share of their ships built in China, but it's maybe 20s up to the 30%. And that should be for them relatively easy to move the ships around a little bit so that their Chinese-built ships are not calling US trades as a general rule, right? And they have the capacity to do that. Of course, it's still not optimal. Carriers set up their networks in an optimal way. They will have to move this around a little bit, and this is not perfect, but they can do it. The much bigger question comes from the Ocean Alliance. And there's several reasons to that. Firstly, obviously, you've got COSCO and you've got OOCL in this kind of group that get hit immediately. So then you're looking, okay, within that alliance, can we move the ships around with our alliance partners, right? CMA CGM and Evergreen, and kind of make sure COSCO ships and WOCL ships are sailing non-US trades. And then CMA CGM and Evergreen are helping out on the US trades. Now, Evergreen has quite a low share of its ships built in China. CMA CGM is a carrier with the second highest share of ships built in China, right? So that's still around 40% of their ships built in China. So it reduces a little bit how much flexibility they really have there. So yes, there's a simple solution in trying to work it out with your alliance, but it's not solving everything because actually there's no guarantee that you have enough ships outside of it.
And presumably then, the Red Sea situation and the diversions in the Red Sea, that will impact, if that reduces kind of capacity in real terms, that will actually limit options as well, presumably.
Yeah, I think, and maybe if you look at it more the other way, right? If we freed up all the capacity in the Red Sea, that would also free up a lot of non-Chinese tonnage, right? And then maybe you're in a situation, should demolition pick up, that actually Chinese ships get demolished at a faster pace than the rest of the world, right? That's feasible. So yes, definitely, all this extra pressure we have on the fleet at the moment is a problem.
It's an important fact, though, isn't it? Because the new proposal doesn't come in for 180 days.
Yeah, we're in October.
You know, the world of shipping looks dramatically different as we sit here talking now compared to what it did a week ago. So in 180 days, you know, we're carriers will be planning for the scenario in 180 days, probably as it is now, but it probably won't be, will it? You know, we don't know what, I'm not saying there's going to be a return to the Red Sea in 180 days. Would you rule anything out? Would you rule any partial return? And certainly Chinese carriers, possibly. If we're talking about Chinese carriers as well, but if there is a partial return to the Red Sea, perhaps it would be those Chinese carriers that maybe would be more inclined to go back to the Red Sea first, and potentially that would, help to mitigate the port fees as well.
Yeah, and I think absolutely. When I think about the picture we'll be looking at in October, and of course we have no guarantees, to me the impact of tariffs in the US is much more likely to be kind of the pressing issue than a return to the Red Sea. I think we're still sort of quite a long way off of that. Certainly for kind of a big, large-scale response that would really affect capacity. But, we've got this 90-day pause on reciprocal tariffs. What the situation then looks like in 6 months' time is really another unknown. And yes, the Red Sea absorbs a lot of capacity, and that means that the supply-demand fundamentals are off. But if you see a significant drop in demand, especially into the US, then that also changes things considerably. And possibly there also you have carriers dealing with overcapacity.
Yeah. And it's interesting because we'll come on to tariffs, I'm sure, well, if we have time, we'll come on to tariffs. But the tariffs are kind of, hitting a shipper's total landed cost. That tariff is the cost of importing the goods. There is a distinction, isn't there, here? Because the port fees are directed at the carriers, and it's an important distinction, isn't it? Because there's going to be a dynamic, isn't it, between the alliances. For example, if you were a carrier that was less exposed to these port fees in an alliance with a carrier who was more exposed to the port fees, could they say, you look after yourself? I know that maybe alliance is the wrong word to describe that group of carriers, isn't it? Is there going to be a danger of carriers kind of the alliances being not a rosy garden?
I doubt it, but it's the question. I think it's a fair question to raise. But I don't think so, especially with the new alliances and all the other things going on. You want to be firm with your alliance partners. Ocean Alliance, the only alliance that's really survived this latest round of changes, so there is a different dynamic there. They know each other well. But actually, I just want to bring up one other thing, right? And we've talked about these port fees within an alliance. But the fact of the matter is these carriers also offer non-alliance services, right? COSCO, WOCL have services they operate on their own into the US. And that's suddenly, okay, what do we do with those? And maybe that's where you play a little bit more on the smaller ship sizes. and avoiding the fee altogether by being under that limit. But again, that means you're changing your setup. It's moving away from what you set up as optimal, and it's now becoming something different. So that's also something to bear in mind, that yes, alliances on those major trades are key, but there is also non-alliance capacity that's going to be affected. COSO obviously at the top of the list, but the same goes for other carriers who have a high share of their capacity built in China.
There's an important distinction between these two cost pressures. Shippers who have been essentially targeted by the tariffs because it impacts their overall cost of importing the goods, whereas the port fees are directed against the carriers. They're the ones that are going to get a knock on the door saying, pay this money. So if you're a shipper, how do you approach this situation? Because would you say I'm already getting hammered by tariffs? You're on your own to the carriers. This is your cost pressure to absorb, or you help me out with the tariffs and I help you out with the port fees. What does a shipper do?
I don't think there's going to be much helping out with tariffs, but the question kind of speaks more broadly to how costs work in container shipping, right? It goes the same way. Is your freight rate linked to the cost that a carrier faces, or is it linked to supply and demand and what the market gives, right? We have this conversation internally an awful lot about, what is the rate? How do we break the rate down between different surcharges? What gets passed on here? And at the end of the day, right, whether it's in the surcharge or it's a base rate, you're just paying the rate, right? And that's a comparison. And to us, that has an awful lot to do with supply and demand, right? And at the moment, we're seeing these softening fundamentals when you look purely at freight rates, which would suggest that actually carriers don't have all the power to just fully push these costs on, but they're going to try, right? They always try. And this is kind of, you can say this is a reasonable cost increase that they are facing. There are other surcharges where maybe you question it a little bit more and you can push back a little bit more easily. But in this case, that is a cost increase, and they will try and push it on. But if you're a shipper and you have one carrier who's pushing more surcharges on and the other is saying, actually, it's covered, I know where I would put my volumes, right? That's the other thing.
This 180 days, does that maybe help the shippers that are kind of pushing the long-term contract negotiations? They've kicked the can down the road a little bit in terms of carriers have got this 180 days now to effectively try, however they do it, to manage these port fees. And a shipper may think, actually, these 180 days are a good time to say, well, actually, Mark, freight rates have been softening. You want my volumes? I'm not paying those. I'm not contributing to those port fees. Or is that kind of antagonistic and counterproductive in terms of your operational relationship once you sign the contract?
Well, there's arguments for both, right? We've spent a lot of time over the past years talking about moving beyond just the freight rate and saying, okay, you need a partnership that you can call up, and when things go wrong, you can talk to each other and figure it out, right? And that goes both ways, even in today's situation, right? If you signed a contract 1st of January, you as a shipper are sitting there thinking, the rates you signed on 1st of January were signed in a very different environment, right? What's happened since then? If we just take two big things, it's not exclusive. You've got tariffs and you've got these port fees. So if you're a shipper and you're looking at exports out of China, right? You're suddenly seeing, I actually want to export a lot less out of China than I thought I needed to when I signed this contract. And that means you're not living up to your MQCs, right? Your minimum quantity commitments. So you as a carrier can stand there saying, we signed this contract. I thought I was going to get 100 containers a week from you. Where are they? And you as a shipper say, well, they're not there because it cost me 145% to import. And that's their deal. So it's the carriers on the other end saying, well, I've also got these port fees. But, if that's the level of the relationship, then it is going to be that backwards and forwards. But if there is more of a partnership in saying, okay, we're both in a different situation than what we thought we'd be, let's figure this out together, that's often where the best kind of outcomes come from. But it all depends, right?
And I suppose it's the same situation within the alliances, isn't it? Is it in the long-term interest of the alliance to say you're on your own, Costco?
I think I still doubt that, but possibly. And I think also just fundamentally, right, 6 months from now, a lot of stuff can happen. So if you're a shipper at the moment, this probably isn't the top of your list of worries, right? It will be there as oh yes, we have to deal with this. But knowing your position, knowing what tariffs will apply and all that kind of stuff at the moment, all that sort of should be getting sorted out before we get to October and the deadline for these fees.
Well, yeah, well, I suppose that, if you're signing a contract now, or you running an RFQ for a contract now, a new long-term contract, that contract is going to, if it's a 12-month contract, is going to run into the period when these port fees apply. So it has to be a conversation that they have during the negotiations as to what are the surcharges called. Are they going to be explicit port fee surcharges? Are they going to be terms something else within the contract? It could cost big money, couldn't it, when that contract comes into effect?
Yeah, and I think when we've been looking at this kind of falling market, right, and the expectation that if you sign a 1-year contract now, rates will fall in the meantime. And one of the ways to kind of make sure you benefit from that decrease is to look at the contract you're saying and say, actually, we want to renegotiate at this point. If they return to the Red Sea, we want to trigger a renegotiation. If whatever else happens, that actually you're not locked in purely for 12 months. There's a space for kind of communication. And this could be one of those things you add in, right? Okay, when it comes to the 1st of September, we're going to take an assessment of where things are and see how that pushes into rates. And that's if you're having that one-to-one conversation with your carrier. If it's your linked to index-linked contracts, you're going to be following what the market does, right? If you're linked to the spot market, but also on the long-term market with these kind of new surcharges that the carriers will try and push through. So again, it's a balance between pushing for that lowest freight rate versus having a contract that is kind of, you can reopen it and renegotiate at some certain trigger points, and this might then be one of those things you add.
Yeah. Because, we do talk about index linked contracts a lot, don't we? And, some customers, SNS customers, are using them maybe for some other customers, whether it's volumes or whatever it is, their unique business. They're not, it's not the right solution for them just yet. But I suppose this situation demonstrates that whatever contract mechanism you choose, actually, it's about more than just the basic freight rate that you agree with the carrier. It all, the actual kind of the terms and conditions about surcharges. Presumably, they can have just as big a kind of cost implication as you can agree a lower price, can't you? A lower rate, and then get hammered because you haven't done your due diligence on your T and Cs.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that's where maybe a rate that is a little bit more expensive today, but with these surcharges built in, might end up being the slightly cheaper one if we get these renegotiations and those here, particularly the Red Sea surcharge, but it goes for others as well. If that suddenly gets removed, that contract is more valuable than one where you just agreed to a flat base rate and signed up for 12 months. But again, there's so many different things going on. And I think particularly with tariffs, it's really right now trying to deal with, okay, what do we do here and now? And then over the next coming months, kind of figure out, okay, how do we deal with this in the slightly longer term beyond just short-term panic?
Yeah. And it kind of leads us, I suppose, onto the wider question of tariffs, that doesn't it? Because if you're a shipper operating a trade from China to US East Coast or US West Coast, if there are falling volumes due to the tariff war, presumably, again, that also has an implication on your negotiation with a carrier on that trade. If the volumes have taken a hit because not as many people are exporting directly out of China into the US.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's interesting at the moment, right, is there's a balance because a lot of the services that would call China would also call other ports, whether that's in Southeast Asia or in North Asia, right? So actually maybe 1 or 2 port calls down in Southeast Asia, 1 or 2 in China, and then maybe up to Japan, South Korea. So we're looking at kind of significant drops in demand out of China, fewer volumes, and we're seeing a rise in blank sailings as carriers try to adapt to that. But in reality, a lot of these services are seeing an increased demand out of the non-Chinese ports in this kind of 3-month 90-day pause that is instead, pushing people to front load ahead of another unknown come July when the question marks around these reciprocal tariffs will be back up. So there's a definite drop out in volumes out of China, but to a certain extent there are higher volumes out of the rest of the region that will be making up that balance a little bit, but not enough, right? We'll still see falling demand.
What kind of nations are we looking at those increasing volumes?
Well, so we look at Vietnam, we look at Cambodia, Thailand, right? They were some of the ones that had 40+% on Liberation Day announced. Same, also Japan and South Korea, right? I think we're hearing quite a lot about negotiations there. But if you have the opportunity and you can front load and you can store your goods, I would think you would want to do that instead of assuming that come 9th of July or whatever the precise date is, there's going to be an agreement and tariffs won't increase, right? I don't think that's a bet that a lot of people who have alternatives would be willing to make. Not everybody can do it.
So is this the increase in volumes, export volumes, for example, out of Vietnam? That's a case of shippers on that existing trade lane front loading import from Vietnam rather than a shift of volumes from China to Vietnam at the moment.
I would think so. And obviously there's going to be a bit of both. But there is definitely, and we've seen it right in reaction to the first trade war, a lot of investments into Vietnam and those Southeast Asian countries. So they can export more. And I think, if there wasn't this deadline that these other countries might also get higher tariffs come July, then maybe it would be more from China through these countries. But I think given the pressure there, they are also working on getting everything they can out to the US in this window.
If you're going to kind of lay your chips on the table, you're going to probably, if you had the choice of China or Vietnam, the focus of the US is going to be more towards, more severe tariffs on China than it is to Vietnam, presumably. So, would shippers already be exploring things are going to get worse out of China? Let's start the process of importing goods from Vietnam instead.
Oh yeah, in that sense, yes. Yes. I don't see why you wouldn't. It's more a question of how quickly you can do that, right? If we're seeing higher volumes already now, 10-ish days after the tariffs were paused and those from China went up, how quickly you could kind of do that. And again, how comfortable you feel making that decision, because yes, China has the highest tariffs, but these other countries got 40% plus. And let's not forget, in all of this, there are 10% on everybody, right? On all imports from these countries. So that's not nothing either.
That goes back to our first point.
That's what we were worried about. Exactly. That's what we were spending a lot of time, and it was a huge disruption, but that's just kind of the baseline now, and everything comes on top of that.
In the same way, the new port fees shouldn't be a cause for celebration. A 10% tariff on every country in the world isn't good news, is it? There's nothing for us to kind of, sit here and go, oh, fantastic, it's only 10%. 10% is 10%.
Yeah, I know. And I think the IMF was just out with their forecast for global growth down to 2.8%, which is almost half a percentage point lower than in January. So even just over that short period. And that's global. That's not just the US, right? The US is clearly going to get hard by this. So no, but again, I think if you come back to kind of the sort of longer term questions, where is a safe spot to set yourself up, right? Is Vietnam what you're going to bet on, hoping that 40% doesn't come? In the way that many did during the first trade war, also how they did with Mexico in particular. What do you think is the scope of these tariffs and this level of trade animosity? Is it something you want to set up your future supply chain for and make those investments that might only bear fruit in 5 years' time? Or are you saying we need to deal with the next 4 years and then we hope that things will go back to a normal?
Yeah, but tariffs don't get taken away, do they? This is a problem, isn't it? Because during the first trade war, 2018, I think those tariffs continued through the Biden administration, and then they're still in now. So, if this current kind of escalation in the trade war sees tariffs, 125% or whatever it is now, that's going to still be in place, isn't it? And if the tariffs are likely, they're hard to, they're sticky, aren't they? They're hard to, they're not easily removed. So if that's there for a foreseeable amount of time, then it must make places like Vietnam or Cambodia or India, even if they get hit by 10% or 20%, it must make them more attractive. And in the scenario planning that shippers will be doing, they have to make some decision, don't they? They have to have a strategy as difficult as it is. So it's about probabilities, presumably.
Yeah, I totally. And I don't know better than anybody else. I think I have an idea that these tariffs are so painful for the US economy that another administration would look at it and say it's not worth it, right? Because at the end of the day, what's the goal? To get jobs back to the US. And there are so many ways of looking at that and saying, this is not how you go about it. Absolutely, the Biden administration kept those first set of tariffs in place and brought in some new ones. But I think this scale on your biggest source of at least container imports, it's a different level. And I don't think we should run on the assumption that this is what it's going to be from now on. I think there's still an element. But again, I don't have to make decisions about where I source my goods from, which means I'm in a very lucky position compared to many of our customers and many shippers.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what, our listeners will be listening to that saying, well, actually, I do have to make that decision. So I want some help. If they're scenario planning, and I'm sure they are, and they're looking at switching supply chain routes, how do they go about it? What are the key considerations and risks and opportunities for them to be aware of?
So can we limit this to in your supply chain or the whole question?
Oh, I'm going to make the question as difficult as I possibly can for you. So, so let's say you're currently exporting footwear out of China, and you're going to get hit by 100+% tariffs, and you're now scenario planning, and you're saying, actually, I can source the footwear from Cambodia. What do they do? And because there's many stages to this, and I know that they'll have an internal process in terms of making sure they can source the footwear from Cambodia, but let's just assume they can. And then that directive is passed down to the procurement team to say, right, get us the best freight contract agreement you can. What scenario planning would they be doing?
So there's several ways into it, right? I think clearly one of them would be to talk to the carriers you have existing contracts with, right? Carriers are also having to deal with this situation and having to deal with shippers coming back saying, actually, our needs have changed. So if you can leverage we have this existing contract, we're not going to be shipping that much out of China. Can we move it over to another trade? But then a whole other range of stuff, right? If you're looking at one trade, it might be that the carrier that was great and much cheaper and more reliable out of China just isn't that great on this other service. Maybe they don't even call the port you need them to call. And again, that looks into kind of Gemini's network. Does that make more sense because they have all these sort of smaller ports and then the main hubs that you can go through? Or do the other alliances call this new port that you want to take? So it's looking into kind of what services are there, which carriers offer the best service, and whether that's in terms of reliability or transit times, right? And those are two different things. You can get a transit time that looks good and build that in and need that, but the reliability, if that's off, that kind of screws you over, right? And it's a balance between all those kind of things. And then understanding where are you importing through, right? If you were importing from China into the US West Coast, that might not be the best option for you if you're importing from Vietnam, right? Because that's a different trade route. It has a longer transit time to the West Coast and a shorter one into the East Coast. So all those kind of things play in as well. And I think in particular, it's the knowledge that you are not the only one looking for new alternatives, right? And that can be a benefit, right? You can say to carriers, listen, we know collectively that we have demand out of this port that we weren't expecting. Can you call here with a service? Or it can be more problematic, right? Are you looking for hinterland connectivity? How are you getting those goods into the port and moving them on? All those things kind of come into play, and you're not the only one doing it at the moment. And that, again, positives and negatives from that.
And presumably, and this is a really big question, but if these tariffs do kind of stay for the medium to long term, and maybe this is what Trump's ultimate aim is, but it does effectively completely shift world trade patterns and trade routes on its axis, and shippers do start veering off the main front haul trades from China into the US East Coast and US West Coast. Those secondary routes, capacity presumably is going to be an issue as well for a shipper, thinking, actually, just because I want to be on that trade doesn't mean to say that the capacity is there for everyone to shift volumes onto that trade.
And that is capacity in several aspects. It's capacity, of course, in terms of the ships and where they are, but also the ports and the infrastructure of getting your stuff into ports, right? They're not there's not an infinite number of ports. We saw it during the pandemic, right? Huge imports into the US, saw congestion at the US ports. It wasn't because there weren't enough ships. It's because it was, the getting the cargo through of the port and onwards was taking too long and building up congestion, and you risk that having again. We've seen over the past few years a lot of investment into port infrastructure, Southeast Asia, in India in particular as well. But it takes time to get this up and running and really having the capacity that it will have at the end of the day. So that's also all to play in. And I think, again, this is not only for people importing into the US. There are going to be knock-on effects for people on different trades, as we always see in shipping, right? It's global. What happens in one place has knock-on effects. So just because you're not touched by that trade doesn't mean that you're not going to feel the after effects of the shifts.
Yeah. So if you're someone listening to this podcast, you're going to be scenario planning. So what we're talking, carrier spread. That's thumbs up on the screen. Carrier spread, capacity, and presumably again shifting. You don't have to shift all of your volumes onto that secondary trade, do you? So it's about will we see maybe shippers just having more trade routes? So procurement professionals, rather than having 2, 3, I don't know how many trade routes that they ship goods into the US on, are they just going to see exponentially more trade routes that they have to procure contracts on? And presumably that's going to be absolutely massive headache for them.
Yeah, if you've had one supplier who gets all your stuff that you need out of China, replacing that isn't easy, especially when everybody else is looking to do the same thing. That's also a capacity constraint. So there, yeah, it's hugely complex to meet. But once you've got figured out where you can get the cargo from, you can make the right decisions to move it then from there to the US or wherever else, using the best carrier for you and your service and rate levels and all the rest of it.
Yeah. So if you're going to have an index link contract, presumably one option that people would consider is have it on the trade lane that you're currently on, your kind of main trade lane now, because there's going to be the workload for those procurement teams, and they're not big teams, are they? In a lot of businesses.
Not all of them.
Not all of them. The workload is going to be huge, isn't it? You're going into territories and regions and ports that you're not, and carriers that you don't have existing relationships with. That's a huge undertaking, isn't it? They're going to have the work out. So would an index link contract on the one that they're familiar with and understand the best be wise?
Yeah, and there's no one answer to that, right? It's going to depend on each and every shipper and their needs. And I think both when it comes to indexing contract, arguably if you're looking maybe to have some freight forwarders to help you out, get that kind of door-to-door thing in a situation that you're not, you don't know this trade, maybe you get somebody in who has experience here to help you out rather than going straight to your carrier. So there are plenty of options. And there isn't one solution that fits everybody perfectly, right? That is also something we need to take into consideration.
We nearly forgot about freight forwarders, didn't we?
Nearly. and they're working hard to get themselves in the right place to be able to help their customers. Of course, try and gain some market share. That's clear. But they're really being forced to respond to these things through their shipping customers, and then obviously through the contacts they have at the carriers.
Yeah, if margins getting squeezed, overall margins getting squeezed with shippers and carriers, then freight forward, I suppose, just makes a freight forwarder's job more difficult, doesn't it, to find the margin for themselves?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so last question from me: is the world for shippers a better place now than it was three weeks ago, before the suspension, the 90-day pause for the reciprocal tariffs, and when the original port fee proposal was in place? We've just been a bit doom and gloom, haven't we, this episode? So people that's kind of procuring freight at the moment got a lot of stuff in their inbox at the moment. So my point is, as you get more information and as you get more clarity on what you're actually dealing with, presumably you then revert to then you go looking for the tools and the solutions that actually helps you to get through it, and they are there, aren't they?
They are, and I'm not going to try and avoid the question, but it depends. If you're a shipper who only ever imports from China to the US, you're in a worse position, right? Because that's 145%. If you had most of your volumes coming from the rest of the world, you're breathing a sigh of relief, at least for this 90 days. So yeah, it really depends on your situation. If worst case scenario, you're a shipper who imports everything from China on Costco's non-alliance service, it's looking really bad at the moment, right? Whereas if you're a shipper who has a more balance and isn't purely looking just at Costco non-alliance services, then you're breathing more of a sigh of relief than you were 3 weeks ago.
I accept that if you're a shipper using Costco and you import 100% of your goods from China directly into the US, you're not in a particularly great situation at the moment. But some of the uncertainty has gone, hasn't it? At least I know the situation is incredibly challenging, but you have more certainty of what you're dealing with now compared to 3, 4, 5 weeks ago. So that if you do need to do that scenario planning, you can start to. I'm not trying to underplay the severity of the situation, but you can start to discuss how we're going to make our way through this, because it's been looming, hasn't it, since Trump was elected at the back end of last year.
No, it absolutely has. If I was in that situation, I don't know how much confidence I would have that in 90 days' time, those tariffs, that the reciprocal tariffs aren't coming back, right? Because that's also a question you have to take. Do we try and get everything we can out of the rest of the world for now before those tariffs come back? And of course, you're going to be scenario planning, but I think that's still quite a big puzzle piece missing when you look out kind of in 6 months' time. What are you going to be looking for? And that is that question mark over what tariffs will be in place in early July when the pause is over. But there'll be plenty of time to discuss that over the next 3 months.
There will. And the next 3, 4, 5, 6 episodes of Freight Debate. Well, I think we've achieved what we wanted to achieve when we introed the latest episode. Things have changed dramatically. We got to be clear to listeners that by the time you hear this, they probably will have changed again. But I think what we've discussed here between ourselves, Emily, is volatility and uncertainty is the only constant, really. So the thing, this kind of scenario planning, whether it's port fees or whether it's tariffs or reciprocal tariffs coming in or not coming in, the kind of scenario planning and the strategies and the concerns and sometimes opportunities, I suppose, that there is true now as they will be in 3, 4 weeks, whatever. Well, thank you, Emily, and thanks to everyone for joining us on the latest Freight Debate podcast. I hope you found it interesting and informative and valuable. We will be back, myself and Emily, in a couple of weeks, I think, isn't it, Emily, for another episode. Who knows what we're going to be discussing and what the situation will be. Depends what Mr. Trump, President Trump, decides to bring in next. So hit subscribe, join the debate, don't miss the next episode, and let's move the industry forward together. See you on the next one.